Away we go. Yay. Welcome to our little goddess group. It's been shrinking week by week, but I love the ones who stay because you're all like super fierce and amazing and into it. So it's really wonderful, and I'm glad you're here. And our goddess this week is Artemis. And so this will be our first of the Greek goddesses, and I do want to do more of them because it's really amazing and fascinating. And it's been a wild ride this last week of kind of living with her. And so Artemis, she's called Diana in the Roman goddess pantheon. So Artemis and Diana are the same. And Artemis is, she's the goddess of the hunt, which you've probably heard. She's, got her bow and arrow, and she's the goddess of the moon. She's the twin sister of Apollo, and they're sort of like night and day. Like Apollo is the sun, and Artemis is the moon, and Apollo is like shiny and out there and like living with the people and playing around, and Artemis is more like hanging out in the forest and staying away from people, and she's definitely a goddess for introverts, which makes me love her so much. A little bit, just to kind of give you a little bit of history about the Greek goddesses, that they're divided into different categories. And so you have the virgin goddesses and the vulnerable goddesses. And then there's one goddess they call the alchemical goddess, the goddess of transformation. Oh, a couple more people coming in, so hang on a second. And you can have your microphones on if you want to. So at any point, please feel free to say anything. Welcome. Hi, Julia. So we're just getting started. We're just going over the sort of categories of Greek goddesses. And so we have the virgins and the vulnerables. There's 3 virgins and 3 vulnerables in this main category. Everybody slept late today. Look coming in. So the 3 virgin goddesses are Artemis, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, and Hestia, who's the goddess of the underworld. And then the 3 vulnerable goddesses. So what we mean, let me go back to that. So what we mean by virgin goddesses, obviously they're virgins, but they really took a stand of like, I'm not going to get married at all. No man for me. No, thank you. Super independent. They do not get victimized, these goddesses. Hey, Julia, welcome. So they are independent. They don't get victimized. They're autonomous. They don't get victimized. They don't really suffer, these goddesses. There's hardly any instance of these virgin goddesses suffering. And that's because they did not have emotional attachments. And then on the other side of it, you have these vulnerable goddesses. And right there, that tells you something huge about them, that they are vulnerable because they form deep attachments, loving relationship attachments, and they're very relationship oriented. These goddesses are Hera, Demeter, and Persephone. And so you have the virgins, Artemis, Athena, and Hestia, and then the vulnerables, Hera, Demeter, and Persephone. And so the vulnerable goddesses, they really, their sense of who they are depends a lot on being in relationship. Whereas the virgin goddesses, their sense of who they are is completely autonomous. And the vulnerable goddesses, here's the thing though, it's like we've got all of these in us, and we'll get to this a little bit later, comparing some stories of virgins versus vulnerables, is that if you go too far in either direction, you get in trouble. And so it's not to say like, oh yeah, I'm this one and this is all I am, but it's about finding a balance of can we find all of them inside of us? And certainly we steer more one way or the other. But when we steer too far in one direction, then we get punished often by the other god. Like it happens in many stories that someone will pay homage only to Artemis and not to any of the vulnerable goddesses, and they end up getting in big trouble by the vulnerable goddesses and vice versa. And then you have this one goddess, Aphrodite, and she's sort of in a category all by herself. And she can enter into relationships at her own will, but she can also leave them at her own will, and her sense of who she are isn't bound by those relationships. It doesn't make her who she is, but she also does find some of who she is. She learns about herself through relationship. she enters of her own choosing and she leaves of her own choosing. And so these are kind of, I think we'll try to get through all the categories and talk about all of them. And the first thing I listened to when I started getting it, I was like, okay, let me do like a who's who and a breakdown, like give it to me in a summary. And the first thing these people said, I listened to this podcast and they're like, okay, there was Uranus and Kronos, I think, and they were fighting, and Kronos cut off Uranus's penis, and all the blood and semen flew into the air, and that became the goddess Aphrodite. And I was like, what? Yeah, I know. Masha, you know that story. It's wild. And I had to take a break for a whole day. I was like, I can't. So it is really wild. And there's some really hard stuff to hear in these stories. And for example, like Zeus loved mortals, and he would transform himself often into an animal and rape women. And so it's really intense. And so I'm just going to put that out there, like as a warning, that there could be some trigger stuff here. There's one story in particular that might trigger something. And so I'll tell you before we start it too, because they're hard. They're hard. So I'll let you know when we get there. So if you want to turn the sound off or something for a while, you can. So, but back to Artemis. Artemis, she's the daughter of Zeus. She's the daughter of Zeus and Leto. And Leto, so Zeus was married to Hera. Hera was the queen of the gods. Zeus was the king of the gods. Hera, as a vulnerable goddess, her whole sense of who she is depended on her relationship with Zeus. And because Zeus was often going and sleeping with other women, Hera lost her mind a lot. She was super jealous. And so Zeus impregnates Leto with the twins, Apollo and Artemis, and Hera gets so mad. And Hera, instead of punishing Zeus because he's the king of the gods, she can't really punish him. She punishes the women instead. It's kind of awful. It's like a real example of what not to do, like we want to show up for our girl gang and always lift each other up. And Hera does the opposite a lot of times. And so Leto's pregnant. And Hera tells everyone everywhere, all the gods, everyone, she says, look, don't let her give birth. Don't anybody let her give birth on your land, okay? And none of the gods and goddesses are allowed to show up for the birth. No one's allowed to help her. And so Leto basically is pregnant for like 5 years and wandering like with this huge, I know, like 2 twins. She's got twins and this huge pregnant belly, and she's wandering all over the world like, can I give birth here? No. Can I give birth here? No. Can you imagine? Oh, how traumatic that must be. And so finally Poseidon takes pity on her, and he brings this land up from the ocean. So it's technically not really land because it's from the floor of the ocean, and she's allowed to give birth there, but no one comes to help her. And so Apollo comes out first. He's the first to be born. And then, Artemis comes out first. And then after comes Apollo, and Artemis helps with the birth of Apollo. So she's considered the goddess of childbirth. And which is funny because she never has a child of her own, but she helps birth children into the world. And I like that story in particular because it's like, I think so often as young women, we're forced to like show up and take care of shit really early, and like be a little more grown up than the men, and like always, just sort of like the ways that women help and heal and take care and keep the world going, that we're not even asked to, but we just sort of step in, and it's like, I got it, all right, I'll do the dishes, I'll take the kids to school, or I'll whatever it is. We just really show up. So so she's the goddess. So Apollo's the god of the sun, and Artemis is the god of the moon. She's the goddess of wild animals. They call her the Lady of Wild Things, which I love. And so she's really similar to a lot of the goddesses that we've been studying, these sort of forest dwelling fringe goddesses. Artemis is very much in that category of like living in the forest, living on the outskirts, not doing, she's like, everybody, your whole worth was based on your ability to get married and have a child. And so she's saying, no, my worth is not based on that. And that's radical. So she was sort of like a radical feminist from the get-go. And she's the goddess of the hunt, The moon, protectress of wild animals. Her temple, so her temple at Ephesus was one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. It's gone now, but it's a really wild story about it. You could dig into that a little bit. And so her symbols, often she's seen, of course, with the moon, with her bow and arrow, and often very closely associated with deer, with the stag, and with bear. She's really closely associated with bears. And she's a goddess of nature. And this is what I love about her too, that she's sort of like a goddess of women's groups, like of women getting together, being together. She was always surrounded by her group, like her power posse of goddess nymphs that would all hang out together. And she was definitely a lesbian, by the way, which is so cool. I love that about these stories, you know, because Hindu mythology is super conservative in that way. There's one little story about you know, some transgression between Vishnu and Shiva, but it's also like a transgression and considered really terrible. But in Greek mythology, there's so much gender fluidity. It's really amazing. And even like Apollo, hey, welcome if you just come in. We're just getting started talking about Artemis as the goddess of wild things, wild animals, the hunt, and the moon. And yeah, and Apollo, he's like in love with a man, and then he's in love with a woman, and then he's in love with a man. And so it's really welcomed, you know, whatever your sexuality is. So she's the goddess of women coming together, women's group. She's a goddess of environmental protection. And she's sort of like this woman who prefers solitude, like the nonstop presence of people means that it's hard for her to be present with herself. And so someone who's an Artemis woman is someone who needs that time to like take time away and go into nature. She probably trusts nature more than she trusts humans. You know? And I think we can all identify with that right now. She is, so if you're an Artemis woman, if you got a lot of Artemis, you probably like to live not in a big city and probably in nature. Or if you do live in a city, you recognize that need to get out of it very often and be surrounded by nature, and disinclined to be a wife and a mother. And Artemis, even if a woman who's got a strong sense of Artemis does have children, and I almost cried when I read this, I have to be honest. I don't tell a lot of people this, but I tell you all this, that most of the time I don't like being a mother. I have to, you know, it's really, really hard for me. I didn't like ask for it. It happened. And I love my child more than anything, but like I felt this really deeply. They say that women who have a lot of Artemis, they can connect better with their children as they get older. Like have a really hard time. Same. That was hard to say. I feel like, whew, I've never spoken that out loud before. So, but that's the quality of Artemis. It's like not inclined to do that wifey thing, not inclined to like be the mother. You too, Maria. Oh my goodness, look, I'm so glad we got together today. I'm gonna cry. Right? And it's like we love our children more than anything. And what's interesting about Artemis too is that yes, like not inclined to be like love children and like want to be a mother and want to be a wife, but will defend those people. Artemis Cruz all year. Yes, hope. Yes. Oh my goodness. This is so great. Yeah. But will protect, will defend them to the death. Like that's the mother bear thing. So she's the bear, right? And a mother bear, I heard this story the other day about someone was telling me that her friend was living in the country. That's why I have cats. Yes, totally. And she's also associated with like cats and tigers and things like that, felines, that feline energy. So this friend was saying that her friend lives way out in the country and was driving through his development and hit a baby bear, a cub. It was devastated and like didn't know what to do and got out of the car and then ran away to get help. And good thing he did run away because the mother bear came out and the mother bear destroyed the car, flipped the car over. Yeah, that's Artemis right there. It's like, to the death, will defend what she loves and what is less powerful than her, you know. And so that's where I started to really get into the Artemis, was hearing things like this, that it's all about, she's like the little girl who will defend her friend from a bully, you know, that isn't afraid to be like, hey, don't say that about my friend. that's Artemis. And she can focus on something, right? She's the bow and arrow. So the thing that's often associated with Artemis is this idea of like aiming true, make my aim true. And so she can focus on a distant target and she can get there. And what she loves, she will do battle to save it. And so she is a goddess of social activists and justice and fighting for what's right and staying the path and keeping, like, refining that aim and like honing in, like, what is important to me? What am I going to fight for? Let's go there. Let's fight for that. Yes. So she's ruthless in her desire for justice and protection of those who've been wronged. How cool is that, right? So I'm just going to take one pause for a moment and check in and see if there's any thoughts or questions so far. Anybody? No? All right, cool. We're all feeling her though, I think, right? How about and I know, Amy, you studied Greek mythology, and Samantha, you're reading some stuff about Artemis. So if at any point you have something you want to share, please do, okay? All right, so we'll go back to it. So let me see if I missed anything. It doesn't feel called towards traditional roles. She requires a huge degree of independence and freedom. And I know you all by now, and I think we can all say yes to that. All these goddesses that we've been studying are kind of like that. And for her, so this is where the shadow side comes in, that for her, love, sex, it can be more recreational than an expression of intimacy. And so perhaps, sort of along the same lines as like, who was the goddess that we talked about that had a real issue? I'm blanking on it now. It wasn't Kali. And one of the goddesses, I'll remember it in a moment. But, has a real, we have, it's Saraswati. That's what I'm thinking of. And I don't think we did Saraswati, but Saraswati, she's sort of like all of the gods live in one god plane, and Saraswati lives by herself on another one. And she's really way more interested in matters of the spirit than she is in like day-to-day stuff. And so if you have that Saraswati energy, it can be really hard to be in relationship. It can be really hard to like dig in to the challenges of day-to-day stuff and like have to like, run a household and things, because it's not where your heart is. And so I was thinking about Artemis and how she seems to be a lot like that too. Like she'd way prefer to be out in the forest running with the deer than she would to be like doing her taxes or like, digging into the hard, thing about being in a relationship with a person. Because if you want to be in a loving, long-lasting relationship, there's a lot of hard work that you have to do. And so I think that's sort of the shadow side of Artemis, is that kind of work is hard to do. That it's easier just to like have sex and have fun and then go on to the next one and not have to worry about it. So I see so much of myself in there too. As soon as it starts to get hard, like, okay, I want to run away. I'm going to go back and play in the woods. I'm going to go run to a waterfall. So a couple of stories. I'm going to share some stories. One thing about Artemis is that she's considered a wrathful goddess. So much like Kali, much like a lot of these goddesses we talk about. And if you even just Google, I found this one, I forget where it was, and I could point you to it. I could, on our next get together, I could send it to you. But one page of just all of the instances of Artemis expressing wrath. And it was just this whole list, like Artemis in this one, Artemis in that one. And she's got a temper. And sometimes it's deserved. I keep thinking of her like, if you watch Game of Thrones, she's like Daenerys, right? And Daenerys, if you don't watch Game of Thrones, Daenerys was the dragon queen, and she was a holy bitch. And she would punish people so fiercely, like, things you couldn't imagine. But it was always sort of deserved. But like, do they deserve it that bad? And so there's this whole element of fairness. And that comes up in my heart and life all the time. Like, it's not fair. My kid says it all the time, no fair. And so it really calls us to look at like, is fair even a thing? And who gets to say what's fair or not? And sometimes God is just God. Sometimes the universe just lays it down and that's what it is. And we just have to deal with it how it is. Not fair or not fair, it just is what it is. And so there's a lot of stories like that, but I'll take you back to a story from when she was little. And I always picture her like 6 or 7 or something. And her father is Zeus. And she goes to sit on Zeus's lap. And she's like, you know how little girls can wrap their daddy around their little finger. And she's like, Daddy, you give everybody things. You just bless everyone and you give people presents and gifts. And I want something. And he's like, oh, my little girl, of course I would give you anything. She's like, well, you give people a lot of stuff, so give me more. Give me like a whole bunch of things. And he's like, all right, fine. I'll give you a whole bunch of things. What do you want? And so right, she's ready with her list. She's like, okay, I got my list. Here we go. Number 1, I never want a boyfriend. Ever, ever, ever. I don't want any man to ever touch me. I feel that one really deeply. So never want a boyfriend. Number 2, I want lots of different names. How come my brother Apollo gets all these different names and I just have the one? That's not fair. So she's always fighting for like, how come my twin, the boy, gets this, but I don't get this? And so she's such a fighter. She's a total feminist from like baby, from little, like age 6. So she gets all these lovely, beautiful names. So she's known by all sorts of different names. Number 3, she says, how come my brother has a bow and arrow and I don't? I want a bow. I want a weapon. I don't want to be one of these little passive pretty girls that can't defend herself. And so she spends actually her whole childhood is spent sort of going through the forest and collecting all of her weapons and her bows and arrows. And then she says, this is my favorite one too, Jesus, I want a knee-length tunic, please. None of the stupid long dresses for me. She says, well, I can't run around the forest with a long dress. So she only wears knee-length tunics. And then she says, I want to rule over the forests. Okay, done. And she says, I want a pack of hunting dogs, not lap dogs. Okay, I don't want lap dogs. I want hunting dogs. And then I want a whole posse of nymphs that will walk my dogs for me and defend me from men. Help me defend our camp against the men. And Zeus is like, all right, okay, got it. Yes, yes, yes. And he's like, shush, you asked for everything but the moon. And she goes, oh yeah, that too. I want the moon. And he says, okay, you got it. And so she gets everything that she wishes for. She gets to live in the forest with her nymphs. They're always like naked and playing games. You know what that means. And no, she gets to never have a boyfriend. She does fall in love at one point with our hunting buddy, Orion. And but nothing ever comes of it. And so Apollo and Artemis, they're both they're gay, sort of gay but fluid, you know, like I said, Apollo, there's a great, this is a little bit of a side story, but I find it really amusing, is that Apollo was in love with a boy named Hyacinth. And he and Hyacinth would throw the discus together. That was their game, kind of like playing catch. But there was, his name was Zephyrus. Zephyrus was the west wind. And Zephyrus was also in love with Apollo. And he hated Hyacinth. And so one day when Apollo and Hyacinth were throwing the discus back and forth, Zephyrus came behind Apollo and blew really hard when Apollo threw his discus. And it went and it decapitated Hyacinth. And Hyacinth, of course, falls to the ground, and where the blood spills, a flower grew. And so, you know, I think the hyacinths were past them. They came out last month, but that's where the hyacinth comes from. And I keep thinking, like, there should be a sitcom like Apollo Unlucky in Love and all the ways, because that's not the only story like that. So, there's another, I'm going to tell you a couple more stories about Artemis, and they all have to do with her wrath. And one of them, she has one of her nymphs, her hunting buddies. Her name is Callisto. And Callisto, they're all in the forest and they're hunting and they're playing. And Zeus sees Callisto and he feels, you know, he does his Zeus thing. And he comes down and he, instead of transforming himself into an animal, he transforms himself into Artemis. He pretends he's Artemis and he takes advantage of Callisto and she gets pregnant. And Artemis, when Artemis finds out, she's furious. And there's a lot in here, like sort of the idea is that Artemis gets mad when there's sexual transgression or when a young woman is taken advantage, when she gives up her virginity. And to me, it's like I can see that, like, as a mom, when you're like raising this super powerful feminist young girl, say young woman, and then she's sort of like loses her mind over some dumb boy. And you're like, no, that's not how I raised you. That's kind of what this energy feels like to me. And so when she finds out that Callisto has gotten pregnant, she's had sex and she's gotten pregnant, she gets really mad and she transforms her into a bear. And so Callisto, and the Callisto has the baby, and the baby is a regular boy. And so Callisto is now a bear. So here's the bear thing again. And she's roaming around the forest. And one day her son happens to be out hunting, and he comes across this bear, and he has no idea that it's his mother. And he's ready to take aim at this bear. And the bear is trying to get him to understand, like, no, I'm your mother. I'm your mother. And just as the arrow is about to pierce her, Zeus steps in. And he scoops them both up and he places them in the heavens, and they become Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the big bear and the little bear. So kind of a sweet ending to a sad story. And so, so here's an example of Artemis sort of taking revenge out or being wrathful against someone who had sex, someone who wasn't a virgin anymore. And then I'm going to tell you now a flip story, the other side of that. In comparison, there's Aphrodite. And so Aphrodite is the goddess of love, and she's all about love and romantic attachment and all of that. And so Aphrodite makes this woman, Phaedra, fall in love with a young man named Hippolytus. But Hippolytus is a follower of Artemis. And so no matter what Phaedra does, she chases him, she professes her love. He wants nothing to do with her because he is all about Artemis. I'm like, I don't need romantic love. I don't need anybody. And so the story ends up really awful, that Hippolytus ends up being dragged behind a chariot to his death, I think. They're all pretty awful. And so here you have, on the one hand, if you worship Artemis alone, you're implicitly dishonoring Aphrodite. And so Aphrodite comes and she takes revenge. But if you worship Aphrodite, like in the first story, meaning if you succumb to romantic love, then Artemis takes her revenge. And so that's sort of where you got this light and shadow, where you can't be just one. We've got to always find a way that we can live in between without getting one or the other goddess too mad at us. Makes sense? And then this is the story that I would say a trigger warning, the story of Artemis and Actaeon. So if you wanted to mute me for a moment, if you have any trauma that you think, with men, you might mute this. So the story is actually after Artemis transforms Callisto into a bear, she goes to wash her hands and wash herself off. She sort of feels like, I need to be purified after that. And she goes to the water and she brings a bunch of her nymphs, and they're all naked and they're all in the water washing themselves. And she sees a young man has come, and his name is Actaeon, and Actaeon is staring at the nymphs. And she's like, get out of here. This is private time. Don't look at us. Don't, take your eyes. You don't deserve to even look at us. And instead, so this is interesting too, is that I listened to and I read probably 25 versions of this story, and all of them were the same. And I thought, there's got to be something more to this. And only one, I finally found one of this man who I really love, who talks about the stories, and he told it this way. And I was like, yes, that's what was missing. Says that Actaeon was watching, and he refused. When she told him to leave, he refused, and he began to masturbate to the goddesses. I know, big thumbs down, right? And I mean, me too, right? Me too. But we've been there. And all the other stories are just like, oh, he looked at her and she killed him. I'm like, no, I don't think that's it. And so that tells you something too about how much just gets stuffed under the rug, and it's like, oh, the woman's angry. No, the woman was, she has every right to be angry. She was super traumatized. And so Actaeon's doing this and he won't stop. And so Artemis takes some water where her stag is next to her, standing in the water. And she takes some water, they call it stag water, because it's where her stag is standing. And she flicks it at Actaeon, and immediately antlers start to grow from his head and he's transformed. And now meanwhile, Actaeon is a hunter too, just like she is. And he's got a whole pack of hunting dogs. And this is part of the story that she's looking at him. She's like, ugh, not only are you a disgusting perv, but you don't even take care of your dogs. All of his poor dogs are starving. They're not taken care of. They're just like, they're ill and they're weak. And so they're starving, and they see Actaeon has been transformed into a stag, and immediately they hunt him and they tear him limb from limb. And so it's a little bit of not a little bit, it's a lot of a dark story. But, it's really, this is the Artemis story. Like if you were going to look for one, if you type in story of Artemis, this will be the one that comes up. And so I put it to you all. I wonder what you see in that story. To me, it's about the hunter becoming the hunted. It's about fairness. What's fair, right? Is there fair? And if you know anything about Jungian archetypes, Artemis in this story, he says she is the anima archetype, which is it's about how men view women, right? That the anima is sort of the symbol of men's unconscious views about women. So tell me, any thoughts on that, or about anything so far about Artemis? It's intense, right? I know you're probably all like, oh. Masha, yeah.
Yeah, these stories just straight up, are intense. And when I think about Artemis, I think about her as basically as like a survivor, as the child of a rapist who, none of her friends are safe. Like she never really, I think, feels safe. And I think that a lot of, when I look at how she evolves her personality, between like this insistence on virginity and purity and withdrawal and fierceness and arming yourself, and then also being like, oh, daddy, I need the gift. It's very like, that makes a lot of sense for a child that has been through sexual trauma or lives in fear of sexual trauma, really, and she's the only one. Like Hera is mad, but she's jealous. She's not mad for the sake of the women. She attacks the women. So it's like Artemis is the only one who's like, wait, something's really wrong here. And like trying to bring that balance to the fore. So that's how I view her.
Yeah, I love that. She is the only one that's saying like, no, like, you all have your backwards. We've got to protect, we got to stand up for women. We don't have to like bring them down and get mad at each other. But yeah, something's really wrong here. And she is that person who's like, looks around and says, something's wrong. The way things are right now, this is not okay. And she takes a fierce stand for what's right and fights for it. And, I don't even have to tell you how relevant that is right now, right? Jung saw this story as a myth about spiritual transformation. And I tried to dig into that, and I couldn't find a ton more on it, but something, it's that idea of the hunter becoming the hunted, or somehow the God, it's same as like Kali, and going through the fire, that Actaeon had to sort of face his own darkness and demons and shadow and be torn apart to be transformed, and being eaten by his hunting dogs. Jung says that actually is him becoming enlightened. I don't want to give him that credit. I think he's an asshole. I don't think he gets to have that. But that's what Jung said. And, he was a man too. So there we go. And there are other stories about Artemis, and they all have this sort of similar vein of like wrath and revenge. There's one more that I really like. It's the story of Artemis and Iphigenia. And it's part of the Trojan War, and there's this terrible figure Agamemnon, and he's really like Trumpian. He's really narcissistic and really into his own power and really into boasting. And Agamemnon, at one point, he shoots a deer, he shoots a stag, and it's one of Artemis's beloved sacred stags. And not only that, he brags about it. He's like, "Oh, I'm even better than Artemis." So, I mean, come on, how much does that not sound like Trump? Like, I'm the best. I'm the best archer there is, even better than that woman, for she's lame. And so Artemis gets really mad, of course, and she makes it so that the winds won't blow, and all of Agamemnon's ships that are going to fight this big war, they can't leave port. And so they all pray and they do these offerings to Artemis, and they realize that it's not enough, that what she wants is actually human sacrifice. And so Agamemnon's daughter, Iphigenia, is the one that has to be sacrificed. And he's such an asshole. He goes to his wife and he lies to her. And he tells her they're going to marry their daughter to Achilles. And he says, "Oh, it's great." And so the wife dresses her up in a beautiful bridal gown. It's so heartbreaking. And they take her and they get her up on this platform where she's like all like happy and wide-eyed to be married to Achilles. And then all of a sudden they're going to kill her. And right at the last second, when the sword comes down, Artemis switches her out with a stag. And so they kill a stag instead. And she takes Iphigenia to live with her and all the badass goddess nymphs. And she becomes immortal. And so she gets this great gift. And so it's another hard but beautiful story about Artemis's wrath. And you don't fuck with her. You don't fuck with women. You don't fuck with people, because we will come back stronger. And, and we'll, I like how she added Iphigenia to her crew. Yesterday I was listening to Pod Save America, and they just said this one thing. He said, a movement is built by addition. And I was like, oh yeah, that's so good to remember, like bringing more and more people into the fold. That's how we get powerful, not by, cutting other people down, but by bringing them in. And that was helpful to me, because like I just want to run around the world right now going, how much of an ignorant fuck can you be? And that's not that helpful, Gotta bring them into the fold. So one last thing about Artemis that I really love, to me, so thinking about all these stories, right? The story about how she has to be the midwife for her own twin, right? How courageous, and how that to me is a story about how she is the goddess who helps birth new things into the world, new ways of living. Something new comes in. It wouldn't be without Artemis-like goddesses who are like, I'm here, I'm showing up, and I'm ready to like do the dirt. I mean, it's bloody work, right? Birth is messy and it can be bloody, and it's just, and she's there for it. She is like ready to birth this new thing into the world, no matter how messy it can be. And she's surrounded by these wild animals. And the wild animals, I was thinking how they could represent fear. Sometimes our fear is like this wild animal, and she's not afraid of the animals. She's also not putting them in cages. She's like walking with the fear. She's got the bear and the stag next to her, and the tiger and all the other wild animals. And so she walks with fear, but she doesn't let it consume her. And she's, just this goddess of incredible focus and courage, who will stand up for those who are marginalized and those who have been hurt and abused. And she will fight fiercely, tooth and nail, no matter what it takes for those people. She is the goddess, to me, of courage. Wanted to read this to you. I don't know if you all are familiar with David Whyte, the poet. He's an incredible poet. This is one of my all-time favorite books, Consolations. And it's a brand new one again, because I give it to people all the time. I'm like, you need this book, you need this book. I've given it away so many times. So here's what he says about courage. And to me, every word of this is 1000% Artemis here. Courage is a word that tempts us to think outwardly, to run bravely against opposing fire, to do something under besieging circumstance, and perhaps above all, to be seen to do it in public, to show courage, to be celebrated in story, rewarded with medals, given the accolade. But a look at its linguistic origins is to look in a more interior direction and toward its original template, the Old Norman French cœur, or heart. Courage is the measure of our heartfelt participation with life, with another, with community, with work, with a future. To be courageous is not necessarily to go anywhere or do anything, except to make conscious those things we already feel deeply, and then, this is the best, to live through the unending vulnerabilities of those consequences. I'm going to say that again. To be courageous is not necessarily to go anywhere or do anything, except to make conscious those things we already feel deeply, and then to live through the unending vulnerabilities of those consequences. To be courageous is to seat our feelings deeply in the body and in the world, to live up to and into the necessities of relationships that already exist, with things we find we already care deeply about, with a person, with a future, a possibility in society, or with an unknown that begs us on and has always begged us on. To be courageous is to stay close to the way we are made. We become courageous when we live closely and to the point of tears with any new possibility made known inside us. Whenever we demonstrate a faith in the interior enunciations and align ourselves with the new and surprising and heartfelt necessities of even the average existence. To allow ourselves to feel deeply and thoroughly what has already come into being is to change our future, simply by living up to the consequence of knowing what we hold in our affections. Isn't that great? So it's a lot, I know, but I recommend highly this book. And to me, that's really it, that, you know, courage is our heartfelt participation with our life, our community, our work, and our future. And that's what Artemis is asking us to step up and live through the vulnerabilities. And I'm feeling that really deeply right now, the vulnerabilities of like showing up and showing up with radical honesty about what's in here, and, you know, how I've been showing up so far and how I can change that. And, you know, we've really got to do that right now. So I open the floor to all of you to please say anything and everything that you're feeling or thinking right now, or just to like sit there and go, yeah, whoa, whatever it might be. Anybody?
It might take me some courage to say this, but I told Kelly that I've been reading a 250-page dissertation on how Artemis became the Virgin Mary. And that her temple in Ephesus that Kelly mentioned was destroyed and replaced with a Catholic church, and the people retaliated because they were trying to, I think it was John the Baptist, perhaps, I think it was trying to make a male deity and didn't want a female deity anymore. And they were like the Artemis worshippers, just, which was a mass amount of people, were retaliating and protesting. And he said, okay, fine, like we'll keep a woman in there and she'll become the mother of Jesus.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And I'm just like thinking about like the word virgin, and how in sort of this context, virgin used to mean a woman who owns herself, right? Mm-hmm. It didn't mean pure and chaste. It just meant we're sovereign, right? And so then all of a sudden you turn Artemis into this mother archetype, because so it just feels like the dismantling of like women are only good for this, you know, or so it's just kind of blowing my mind. Like I was just thinking about what you were saying about motherhood, and I'm like, and then they turn her into the ultimate mother.
Because that's the only way men know how to relate to a woman.
Yes.
Oh, they can't relate. And it's the same thing that happened with all these goddesses from India, that there was this huge culture of these wild, powerful, independent goddesses. And then the white man came from the north, the Aryan invasion came through and changed all the stories. and took them out of the temples and put Shiva in there and Indra in there instead. And so I think the whole, like, it's not just limited to India or Greece, like everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
Stories at some point, the stories got changed and the woman was put in her place. And it's like, that's how we can handle a woman. We can handle her as a mother. We can handle her as a pure, chaste little girl, but we cannot handle her as a sovereign woman who doesn't need us. Yeah.
Right? And I took a goddess mythology course in university, and in the textbook it systematically is written with the death of the goddess, like how the goddess was systematically murdered through myth. And it's Tiamat, it's the myth of Tiamat, the dragon goddess, where they actually murder her and they make her wrathful. She's actually trying to protect things, and like she does kind of the same thing, like stirs up all the elements and stuff like that. And that they're just like, we can't have this, like she's too dangerous, and they murder her and replace her with a male god. And I cannot tell that story without women just fall. It's like in our DNA, you know, that feeling of like being erased, you know. So yeah, it's wild.
So in our DNA, you know, like I've been thinking about this a lot. If you've been in my class, you've heard me say it about how epigenetics has proved now that there's 14 generations in our bones.
Yes.
14, like how many? It's 1400 years. So go back to like when this was happening, when female goddesses were being replaced, when temples were being knocked down. I mean, that's a little earlier, but I bet that's still in our bones too. But even back to 500 CE, it was happening. In India, it was happening that the goddesses were being taken out of temples and the gods were being put in. And so we have that that trauma is in our bones. Yeah.
And I know you like astrology, Kelly, and I was just listening to Molly McCord talk about Sagittarius in the South Node. And I am a Sag, so I feel this so strongly, but she would, so there's the bow and arrow. So she was
just had a lunar eclipse. There was just a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius. Yeah.
And now it's in the South Node until 2022, which is like, all of this is blowing my mind, because she said, I didn't know this ever, like through all the stuff I've learned on astrology, that the Sag is the sign of alienation. So we're going to start speaking our truths like we're doing now, but we're going to start to feel alienated, and there's a risk of losing our families over this, losing our inner circles, all of this. And she was saying that this goes until 2022. This Sag and South Node. And so she said, we're going to have a complete wipe of our religious beliefs. What? I know. And I went, oh my gosh, because in the tarot, 2021 is the year of the Hierophant. And right now we're in the year of the Emperor, and look what's happening. And last year was the year of the Empress, and that was the Me Too movement. So like, look what's happening. And now we're going into Hierophant, which is religious authority. And so I'm just like holding on to my hat, because I don't know what's going to happen.
Hold on to your hats, lady. She's going to get crazy. This is when we gather. We're like in the forest right now, gathering our group, our posse, our people, and we're gathering our tools, our bows and our arrows, and getting ready for the big hunt, and just taking down anyone who who marginalizes or abuses people. It's time. Yeah. Thank you. Anybody else? Anything? Any last thoughts? No? All right.
I was thinking of something, Callie.
Yeah.
When the story of Actaeon, kind of going to what Samantha said, like this way of kind of erasing the way women feel by making us hysterical, like, oh, he just looked at her and she overreacted. And I just love that you had that sense of like, no, there's more to it. It's not just like, he stumbles upon them and looked at them, and you know, it's so like, we've all had that, right? Like, what? I just told you were pretty, or I just told you to smile, you know, like those things, like you're the one that's crazy. So like that, just like, I can feel that energy, like, oh, I want to smite him too.
Yeah. Definitely. Though, if you're interested in who that person is, where I got that from, it's a couple, I don't know exactly what their story is, but it's this a man and woman, and he sounds definitely very gay. I don't know if he is or not, but I just sort of like him. Mythological gaslighting, yeah, totally, Samantha. But they tell the stories in a way that nobody else does, and they're so much more real. So it's a podcast, and it is called Myth Understood. And they do it like, they're really hilarious. Like she's a comedian, I think, and so he'll like be like, he'll play one, like they do like Apollo and Artemis, and they'll answer the phone, and Apollo calls Artemis, and she's like, what do you want? It's like, it's really fun listening. So if you're into mythology and you want to stick that on when you're in the car or something, Myth Understood. And yeah, that's where I found the whole roundup. There's a 1 hour long roundup of like who's who in the whole shebang in 1 hour. So that's worth listening to also. All right. Well, thank you as always for participating and sharing and making me feel like I'm not alone with this Artemis stuff. So I'm really feeling seen, and I hope you all are too. And I'm not sure if you have suggestions for which Greek to do next. Thank you. No, thanks, Samantha. Otherwise, I'll find some cool, badass woman to inspire us next week. But if you have any suggestions for weeks going forward of people you want to hear about, let me know. I'm thinking, Circe, love this group. I know. I love you all so much. I'm so grateful for this hour of sanity, and I'm really crazy. I like you. She had a list. Yeah. Yeah, I can relate too. It's like, here's what I want, and I'm not backing down. Yep, definitely. And we don't have a list. Let's make a list, right? Let's make a list and check it off. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you same time next week. Bye-bye, goddesses.